If you played games sometime between the end of the PlayStation 2 era and the beginning of the Xbox 360, you probably remember this. There was a point where, seemingly overnight, everything turned gray. It wasn't just one game, it wasn't one genre, it was almost everything. Military shooters, post-apocalyptic games, sure, but fantasy games, racing games, even games that had absolutely no reason to look like that were suddenly losing all their color. The strangest part is that it almost felt coordinated, like the entire industry had silently agreed on something. I was replaying a few older games this week when I started wondering, why did everyone decide to do this at exactly the same time? And I think I was getting pretty close to an answer. Honestly, you don't even need to have played games during that era. You don't even need to know much about video games at all to follow this. But to understand why it's actually so interesting, we need a little bit of context. So let's start with the explanation we'll hear the most often today. People usually say developers were simply chasing realism, but that's not really true, or at least not in a way you would probably expect. Because one thing I noticed was that it wasn't just the worlds becoming gray, the lighting changed, user interfaces became darker, even the plots were taking themselves much more seriously. What I'm trying to say is, playing the average game released during that period feels noticeably heavier than playing games that came just a few years later. And that's not just something I imagined. Looking back now, it almost felt like this happened gradually, but when you actually compare the games, it really didn't. Around 2006, you can almost see the shift happen in real time. One game becomes successful with a darker visual style, and suddenly another one is right behind it doing exactly the same thing. For long, it wasn't a trend anymore, it was just the standard. It's almost like someone applied the same color filter to every game being released. And by the way, once you start paying attention, this gray isn't always literally gray. Sometimes it's brown, sometimes it's washed out green. Occasionally you would even see a muted blue. But no matter the color, it always felt like somebody grabbed the saturation slider and dragged it all the way down. And by this point, we can't really blame hardware limitations anymore. The Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were perfectly capable of displaying vibrant colors. Whenever developers actually wanted colorful games, they made them. It's easy to forget that these games all came out in exactly the same hardware. There were games in that very same generation, bursting with color. Believe it or not, water could actually be blue. Crazy concept, I know. So it wasn't that developers couldn't make colorful games. Most of them simply chose not to. And that's incredibly strange because if you go back one generation to a weaker hardware, you will often find games that are much brighter and easier to read. The HUDs were cleaner, the environments were more vibrant. You could instantly recognize characters from a distance, not only by their silhouettes but by their colors, and for that reason I ruled out hardware almost immediately. For a while I kept looking for some technical explanation. Maybe it was an engine trend, kind of like how Unreal Engine 5 dominates so many big releases today. And when you look at modern AAA games, a huge number of them are built on Unreal. Some of them push graphical realism so hard that they slowly start losing their own identity. And if you don't play many games, it's honestly easy to mistake one for another. But that theory didn't really lead anywhere, because once I started researching the engines developers were actually using back then, I realized most studios still relied on their own in-house technology. Bethesda had Gamebryo for Oblivion and Fallout 3, before later introducing the creation engine with Skyrim. EA used renderware for games like Need for Speed and Burnout. Infinite Ward kept developing the Infinite Ward engine, which powered both Modern Warfare and later Black Ops. So the engines were the reason games suddenly lost their color. Maybe everyone was using the same shaders. Maybe HDR was still immature. Maybe nothing. The more games I compared, the more studios I look at, the more technologies I researched, the less any of it made sense. Because even games that had absolutely nothing in common ended up looking strangely similar. And then my script got what I can only describe as divine intervention. I'm being dramatic, okay? I realized I'd been comparing games only to other games. What if I compared games to the rest of entertainment instead? And this is where everything starts making a lot more sense, once you stop looking only at video games. Because the exact period when games became darker was also the exact moment when almost every other form of entertainment changed its tone as well. The early 2000s were a strange time. Natural disasters, wars, the 2008 financial crisis, and of course, 9/11. It's a new century and the mood had changed, especially in the United States. There was this constant feeling of uncertainty, of anxiety, of distrust, and entertainment changed with it. More than ever, people were using it as an escape. Hollywood darkened its color palettes, its cinematography, its stories. You could see it everywhere. Action movies became grittier, more grounded. Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy completely redefined what superhero movies could look like. The Matrix had already embraced the aesthetic years earlier, and the audience couldn't get enough of it. Then there were movies directly inspired by the political climate itself. Take The Hurt Locker, for example, a film born directly from the War on Terror, the military campaign launched by the United States after 9/11. Something I didn't even know before researching this video, because I'm not American, is that the War on Terror technically still hasn't ended. Yeah, it was a pretty heavy moment in history. And during those years, the American military became almost unavoidable across mainstream media, often portrayed as the universal solution to every problem. And, well, people loved it. At the exact same time, anti-heroes start taking over. The Sopranos, Breaking Bad a few years later, characters that weren't heroes but weren't exactly villains either. Morally gray people living in gray worlds. Video games followed the exact same path. God of War, Hitman, Prototype, Infamous, Knights of the Old Republic. The list goes on forever. And it wasn't just movies and games. Fashion changed as well. Black became dominant once again. Leather jackets, long trench coats, silver accessories, that unmistakable Matrix look. Everything carried this feeling of uncertain future. Cold, practical, functional. And after looking at all of this together, the answer suddenly becomes obvious. Movies didn't have game engines. TV shows were limited by console hardware, so whatever happened to games was happening everywhere else too. The gray era didn't come out of nowhere. It was simply part of a much bigger cultural shift. And right in the middle of all of it, video games, a medium that had spent decades trying to be taken seriously, started absorbing that same language. Because back then, games still had to prove they were worth. People constantly dismissed games as toys, as entertainment for children. So this sudden shift towards darker aesthetics almost feel like an attempt to say, look, we can be serious. The stories didn't necessarily become deeper overnight, but the packaging certainly looked more mature. And for that particular moment, that was enough. Slowly, games became less colorful, less playful, less exaggerated. In fact, this was probably the peak of military shooters. Everything became grounded, and it's not hard to understand why. Almost everything revolved around war, political conflict, or the fear of what might happen next. If you go back and read newspaper from that time, the public anxiety is impossible to miss. There was this quiet desperation, so naturally, stories became more pessimistic, more ambiguous. Happy endings slowly gave way to uncertainty, because that's what people were responding to. And that leads directly into a fear, a very specific fear the game industry had back then. The fear of still being seen as something made for kids. At a time when video games were still fighting for cultural legitimacy, developers wanted to prove that games could deal with adult themes. And what's the fastest way to communicate maturity? The aesthetics. If it looks serious, people assume it is serious. That's where all those nearly identical box arts came from. Line up 10 games from that era and you stand a few feet away, and honestly, good luck figuring out which one is which. You already know the image. A soldier facing away from the camera, everything covered in gray, rifle on the right hand, and bonus points if the lighting only shows his silhouette. And eventually, that visual language started spreading to games where it didn't even belong. Of course it did. Once darker aesthetics become associated with other socially accepted mediums, and maturity became associated with commercial success, nobody wanted to be the colorful game sitting on the shelf, the ugly duckling. Big studios did it, medium-sized studios copied them, small studios copied everyone else, because nobody wanted to be left behind. Little by little, gray stopped being a creative decision and became the default. That's where the real problem begins, because when everyone tries to grow up in exactly the same way, nobody actually grows up. Everything starts looking the same. Worlds became harder to distinguish. Original ideas become harder to notice, especially when many of those choices never really made sense in the first place. Not because they were technically bad, but because they were chasing an idea of respect that was flawed from the beginning. And the funny thing is, at the time, it actually worked. Those games sold incredibly well. Many of them received universal acclaim. Some of the greatest games ever made came out during this exact period. The issue only becomes visible years later, or honestly, maybe issue isn't even the right word, because whenever something is designed to satisfy the cultural moment it's born into, it's only natural that it feels different once that moment has passed. Today, the colors are back. Whether that's a good thing or not is a different conversation, but it's definitely true. And I don't think games became colorful again because the world suddenly became a happier place. They became colorful because games finally grew up. Not in a way that the industry thought they had to back then, but as a medium. Over the last 2 decades, games have become too big to keep proving they deserve to exist. But whenever you go back to that gray era, it's almost impossible to not notice the fingerprints it left behind. Not just on video games, but on an entire generation of entertainment. A generation shaped by uncertainty, trying desperately to look older than it really was. And maybe that's the interesting part. Those games weren't gray because technology forced them to be. They were gray because culture did. Entertainment doesn't just reflect the world around us, sometimes it reflects the fears we are all trying to hide. So maybe the real question was never why did every game become gray? Maybe the better question is, were games actually becoming more mature, or were they simply afraid of not being taken seriously? I'm Lila Skeleton. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all. Have a great day.